everyone. Welcome to Constellation Conversations with Rowland Smith and myself, Nicola Dunn. Robert, we were talking before we started filming, and the subject we decided to address today was fate.
Yeah, not a small issue.
Not at all. So what are your thoughts?
Well, it's a big subject. So I think, like anything, we need to begin by breaking it down a little bit somehow. Maybe start with the popular notion of what fate is. We could start with that, and maybe also distinguish fate from destiny, because obviously the two get sort of jumbled up a bit. So let me have a go at this. I think probably the way most people think about fate is in terms of, it sounds a bit dismissive to put it like this, but pop psychology. You know, am I fated to meet my lover, or what does my zodiac say to me about my fate? And it's sort of related to the stars, you know, the idea that our fate is somehow written in the stars and predetermined for us. So on the one hand, that I suppose with that comes a little bit of a sense of helplessness. You know, what does fate have in store for me, as though I just had to wait for fate to, you know, to direct my life, if you like. Although I think it also has a more positive set of connotations to it as well. You know, my fate is to succeed in life. But it's worth also saying, and I've been thinking a lot about Greek tragedy recently, that fate also has, you know, the notion of the fateful about it, you know, fate worse than death, the tragic. So not just what's predetermined and out of our control, but that which leads to something tragic or apocalyptic. So I think those are probably some of the notions or connotations of fate that are in the culture, as it were. If you want to sort of have a conversation in the pub about fate, that those are perhaps some of the things that people would first think about. What do you think?
I agree, and I think the sort of poor cousin of fate is luck, good luck, bad luck.
Yeah.
And in a sort of constellation sense, and it'll be interesting because, you know, it'll be interesting to hear what you've got to say and what I have to say about that. It's almost as though fate is about what has already happened within the system. So that you're born into a system which has had fate, it's had experiences. So it's not so much about predestiny, but it's about acknowledging what has happened already.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that probably takes us to a distinction between fate and destiny that I certainly hear in the constellations environment, which is exactly as you say, and it's a bit crude, but let's work with it for now. Fate is the past and destiny is the future, broadly. So it's, as you say, not necessarily about what predetermines your future from the past, but fate is the collection of stories and influences and pressures and trajectories and arcs and all the rest of it that have mounted up in your system and continue to have an effect, a strong effect on your own life, a bit like a kind of genealogical version of gravity or something. Like you're in that field. There's a pull, yeah, exactly. And indeed, perhaps even a push, you know, towards doing some things then in the future. But it's not quite saying that, you know, if there was a difficult fate in your past, that you are fated to repeat it, but nevertheless, it will have an impact on you that needs to be managed in some way. And I think that is different from, you know, destiny, because I don't think, maybe you feel differently, I don't think destiny is ever pre-decided in a constellation. The future is never sure. It can always, you know, there can always be choices and consequences from those choices, which will take one's destiny in a different direction.
Yes, because, you know, really, when we're working with a client, they've brought an issue that is very close to their heart, something that's important to them, and we're focusing on that. And the constellation is really about, it's interesting you use the word, you know, push as well as pull, is what is the next step for the client? So in a sense, we make our own contemporary fate and destiny by the steps and choices that we make, but having an awareness of those forces, those tides in our system is very, very helpful, because we we have a capacity to almost to navigate. It's like, I'm just thinking, I've got sort of marine images, the sense of you work with the tidal forces of the sea and the wind and the weather, and you can either work with them or you can absolutely rail against them and see where that takes you.
I like that metaphor, the tide. It is, I think it is like that. It makes me think it might be worth making a connection, which I hadn't made before. You helped me make it, between fate and belonging, because there are those tides in a family system which carry people along and perhaps push them to repeat patterns from the past. Like, for example, alcoholism is often a very common pattern in a family, for example. And what is mixed up in that repeating of the pattern, that going with the tide of the fate of previous family members, is a more or less conscious sense that that's the way you belong. You belong to your family system by adopting, absorbing, incorporating, mimicking, repeating the fate of those who've come before. So even where that fate is tragic, somehow the cost of tragedy is a bit less than the gain got by belonging with the people who've come before. So I just wanted to make that connection.
I think that's really interesting the way you've described it. It's like, do I, in order to belong, do I have to fail in the same way?
Yeah.
Or do I have permissions to have successes in my life that my parents, my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, etc., didn't have? Given, and I always say, given the opportunities of my generation, because each generation has particular opportunities.
Yeah, that's brilliant, isn't it? Do I have, yes, am I going to fail in the same way out of a kind of loyalty or belonging? That's a wonderful phrase. I love that. And yes, you're right, the opportunities do shift over time. So it's not as if fate doesn't kind of morph through the generations and over periods of history. Yeah.
And we see that often, don't we? I'm sure you've met it many times when issue holder or seeker will say, you will talking about family history, they'll ask a bit about parents, and they'll say something like, my father died at 52 and I'm 51.
Yeah.
And that somehow these seminal events make markers in our own trajectories, which we're very, very conscious of.
That is a brilliant example. And I have heard that, yes, almost literally those words. Yes, or, my mother fell ill when she was, whatever. The other distinction I want to bring in that's on my mind, or maybe a kind of point about fate, is that although there is something about fate which ties us to family system and kind of envelops in that us in that, for good or ill sometimes, when people then go on and join with another family system in a love relationship or a marriage, for example, maybe I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, but I'll say it, you then, as it were, have two family systems, coming to meeting one another through the, husband and wife, or husband and husband, or wife and wife, whoever it is getting married or in a relationship. And I've noticed that even where there is strong bonding between two people, there can often be a force of separation that runs through that bond or undoes that bond, because the family system they arrive with exerts the stronger pull, to use your word, on them. And that reminds me in turn that the word in French for fate is le sort, S-O-R-T, like you're literally being sorted onto a different track, and this is a rather kind of tragic thing to say, so this is the mood I'm in at the moment. But I think there is something about fate which, although it connects us through a kind of belonging energy to family and so on, is also something that separates us as well. So there's something, I think, very lonely too and separating about fate. Like, put it very kind of vividly, Nicola, you and I have a different fate. We're great friends, we're very fond of one another. And at the same time, we know that in all sorts of different ways. We're on quite different trajectories, you know, and our fates separate us, actually. And friendship and maybe love, and I'll say I really am digressing here, is probably something that always takes place in the face of the power of separation that fate exerts.
I mean, I think we've got a great conversation to have about love and attraction in a constellation sense. So you've actually sparked me to think about the fate of particular cultures, and by that I mean, and this may appear, as you say, in two people who connect, the fate being that certain events have happened. So slavery happened. The Holocaust happened. Civil wars have happened. The Irish famine happened. So there are all sorts of events that have happened to the cultural ancestry of an individual. And I think sometimes there's a sense of, well, and maybe it didn't, my family were here or there, and it didn't affect them or impact them, or that was a long time ago. But these are deep experiences. And they take, a number of generations to kind of move into kind of a healing integration. So I think it's interesting what you're talking about, that we all have those experiences in our flow as well.
Yes, in a way, when you talk like that, it suggests that fate is a kind of nested experience. Like there's the fate which we might just take upon ourselves by giving ourselves permission to break away and kind of shape our own fate, as it were. There's then the fate of our family system from which we arrive, which has its own kind of pull and encircles us in some way. But then beyond that, as you say, there's a kind of cultural fate which enwraps that too. And those various layers can, all, have their aggregated effect. I was running a session yesterday at Constellations where we were talking about trauma. And I think it's worth pointing out that even where there is a shared cultural fate between two people, that they can react to it very differently. Or same with the family system. I've seen twins represented in constellations who run down completely different paths or towards very different destinies. So the fate can be held more or less lightly by individuals. So again, it's not predetermining. There's a dialogue between the individual and their fate that goes on.
I mean, I think I was thinking about twins this morning as well.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
So, and this is maybe a subject for another conversation, but it's, if we accept the term, entanglements in a family constellation setting, I mean, how is that process worked out among siblings? And obviously twins are siblings. So it's the distinction with genetics. So I think I'm not going to sort of go into that deeply now, but I think it's, as you say, twins don't have the same kind of personal evolving fates, it would seem. They may, there's the genetic side of being identical twins, but there is something individual that's also happening.
Yeah.
And so I think it's how we distinguish and sort of tease out the nuances between a kind of a genetic history, or you might even say fate, and systemic one from particular family and as you say, a family having a particular experience.
Yeah. I'm thinking actually of a specific constellation now that I ran a long time ago, where there were twins represented. And one twin had a very, very different, one basically was a success and the other was a failure in worldly terms. And it was very difficult for the successful one to bear the fact that her sister was really struggling in life. And constellations can be pretty tough sometimes, because in a sense, the conclusion was to allow that difference to stand, rather than the older sister trying to kind of bail her younger sister out all the time, which is effectively what she was doing, paying for things and therapy and rehab and all sorts of things. And it made me think, as you were talking there, that there is a danger, I suppose, when we talk about fate, that some people recruit fate in order to position themselves as a victim. So, I'm a victim of all of these things that have come before, and there's nothing I can do about it. I sort of surrender to the tide that you've described, Nicola, and the tide is strong, but sometimes there's a little bit extra there. It's not just the tide, there's the agreeing with the tide, or they're saying, dear fate, I'll let you run my life for me.
Yes, I mean, I think probably both of us would see that being stuck in a victim position for an issue holder or seeker is a very painful place to be. In a sense, I suppose, if we have any wish for them, it's that they are able to reclaim something so they don't stay in that position. Therefore, probably we might agree on the fact of not, of not supporting a position which is, I can't do anything because this is my fate, and people who progress in the way that they want to, they're just lucky. They have good luck, and I've had bad luck. Yeah. So there is that kind of engagement, and I think it's interesting, as particularly with twins, because the question is, if they're identical twins, what was the developmental care the same? We don't know, but it may have been roughly the same. And why did one sort of find firmer ground underneath their feet and be able to progress, and why did the other flail? And we might look at that systemically. And so it happened in that particular constellation, but it may have been that they were in different tides within their family system. Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast the other day about Antigone, the play by Sophocles. Again, this is my current enthusiasm, and it got me thinking about fate. Actually, obviously, Greek tragedy is sort of famous for, as being, what is Greek tragedy if not a sort of presentation of the forces of fate in some way? But it allowed me to think about the difference between law and fate. So, because fate is a kind of law, it's a sort of sense of necessity. Things must happen, that the world is governed by the laws of necessity rather than by the laws of chance and choice or contingency. Forgive me for going into this, but I think there's another sort of angle on it. So in the play Antigone by Sophocles, the heroine, the eponymous Antigone, wants to bury her brother. Her brother Polynices is a traitor to the state because he's led an attack on the city of Thebes. And the city of Thebes is now run by Antigone's uncle, Creon. So there is this clash between the two. So on the one hand, Antigone is desperate to bury her brother, even though he's led this rebellion against the state. And Creon, her uncle, who's effectively a dictator, certainly an autocrat, says, no, he is a traitor, you may not bury him, and indeed his body will be left unburied outside the city walls, exposed to vultures and crows and all the rest of it. Yeah, so it's, not to mention the fact that Antigone is the fruit of the loins of Oedipus and Jocasta, so an incestuous relationship between mother and son. So this is in constellations terms, we had this to constellate. If we had Oedipus in the room to constellate, or Antigone, it'd be a long workshop, put it like that. Anyway, it got me thinking about the difference between Creon, who is the figure of judicial human law. We have a law. This young man, Polynices, has violated the civic law. He must be buried outside the city walls because he doesn't belong, and that's him asserting a kind of man-made law, if you like.
So he's excluded, basically.
He's excluded, exactly. He's excluded, and on judicial grounds, of course, he should be. He's a traitor. Antigone, on the other hand, is appealing to a different law, which I would call a systemic law, which is the law of ancestral rights, practices, bonds, and attachments, which precede the imposition of civic law. And it seems to me that that's also a way of thinking about fate. It's the kind of law which precedes law, the law before the law, those things which we carry. I mean, you used the word genetic, didn't you? We almost carry some of these genetic laws within us, and they compel us to obey them, even at the cost of the kind of social constraints or legal constraints that sometimes we might feel we ought to be under. So that was a long way of illustrating it, but I thought that quite an interesting way to look at it.
Yes, beautiful, actually. And you raised that something I'm sort of quite interested in too, which is about the burying of the dead, having represented Constellation, someone's ancestor who was on a boat that was bombed during the war, and that sense of the absolute overwhelming desire, as I did ask, to actually find soil and bury myself in it, if I couldn't be buried by others. And so it helped me understand something, that this sense of that the dead aren't actually, on one level, the dead are not completely gone to us. It's very important to us in our rituals that have gone over time, that we find our connected dead and we bury them. And I guess even in war too, it's very important, I think somehow on a humanitarian level, that all dead are buried with some level of dignity. So so that's a sort of interesting. Sorry, I just turned my phone off. This is a classic. I don't think they do this on the BBC.
They do occasionally. No, I love that. And to recast what you've just said in the terms of what we're talking about today, maybe that urge to bury the dead is precisely because people talk about closure, don't they? I'll have closure once the burial can take place. And in a sense, what they're saying is, I want to close down now all the openness that fate still might produce. It's sort of, I want to bring an end to that cycle of fate. I want to say, because otherwise we don't know what the fate of that person was until we find the body and put it in the ground. We have an open question. What was that fate?
We are, can't we?
Yeah.
And the arc is going back to the essential earth.
That's right.
Or through fire, we burn bodies as well, whatever is possible. But there's something about sending the body back to nature which completes this arc of fate.
Exactly.
And easily in those that are still alive when that happens.
Yes, fantastic. Because it's the kind of uncertainty, the openness is intolerable, while the body remains unfound, unburied.
Because also there's a sense that also this ancestor, often it's this conclusion that they must have died, but that they're not protected or looked after in any kind of way. Yeah,
and something I think also that goes to the heart of constellations is when you bury the dead, you give them a place. Like literally, you give that body a place. And until that happens, the place is unknown, uncertain, uncontrolled. So you're literally giving them a place in the system. You lie here. Yeah.
About an unmarked grave. We like to mark the grave.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. And it does allow, it is a sort of, it's a full stop in fate, isn't it? Because fate has these kind of chthonic, huge, vast forces to it. But that's one way in which we can gather fate and land it, like almost literally land it, and make it a bit less huge for us. We put it in the ground somehow.
And we talk about laying to rest. So we lay the person's body to rest, but we sort of lay, so there's something that comes to rest for the family as well. And often they talk about it being much more possible to grieve once they've found their dead and buried them.
Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe this is since we're talking about landing things and bringing things to an end and completing things, maybe this is where we should start to sort of bring our conversation to a close. I mean, I didn't anticipate we'd end up talking about the burial of the dead when we began our conversation, but it seems like it's we moved organically through the conversation.
And I feel I'm clearer from your explanations about fate, destiny, and the sort of distinctions really in contemporary sort of conversation, as opposed to when we think about it in terms of the family constellations perspective.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Nicola. Please do like and subscribe. I'm learning how to say these sort of social media things. Please like and subscribe. We both have websites. Nicola's is Nicola Dunn Constellations.com. Mine is my name, RobertRowlandSmith.com. We look forward to seeing you again on our YouTube chats. But for now, thank you very much, and goodbye. Thank you, Nicola.
You're welcome.